My name is Erica Mercer, and I did my project on the Anchorage School District Education Center with an emphasis on the Communications and Community Outreach Department. So when I did data collection, I started with some basic research online. I was able to get just basic information about the Anchorage School District, such as their mission statement, the many departments that they had, and just a description of the functions that they perform. After that, I was able to conduct some interviews. I reviewed the preliminary questionnaire, wrote down questions that I thought would be able to get me the information that I needed, and then I was able to call and set up a time to conduct my interview. I was directed to the Communications and Community Outreach Department and was able to talk to Morgan, who is the Communications Coordinator. She was my point of contact throughout the whole project, and in the first initial interview, we were able to go over all the questions, and I was able to get most of the information that I needed. One of the biggest challenges I faced was the size of the Anchorage School District. According to Morgan, there's 343 employees that work for the Anchorage School District. So I was not able to get a full scope of, the whole business coordination and everything like that. So I had to narrow it down to focus on just Morgan's department, which was the Communications and Community Outreach Department. So when I was making the plan, I had to come up with objectives. So the first objective that I identified was to coordinate the recovery of critical business functions, and later I'll identify what those critical functions are. The second was to ensure the safety and well-being of the employees, their families, and the customers of the Anchorage School District. The second was to maintain the third was to maintain the reputation and the public image of the Anchorage School District. The fourth was to minimize loss of data, and the last was to minimize the critical decisions that had to be made in times of crisis. So the recovery strategies are kind of the core of the BCM. They should be feasible, cost-effective, and adhere to the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. So the recovery strategies that I identify was that first, the business functions would be recovered in priority sequence, and I'll identify that later. Communication is coordinated through the business contingency planning team, and then additional personnel may be called to support recovery efforts. So Morgan was able to help me identify the critical functions of her department, and the first was internal communications, and that was what she identified as the number one priority. So the recovery time objective for internal communications is 1 day. She said it was really important that they were able to maintain internal communications. Data backup was not required, and it can be performed manually. The systems that would be needed would be email and the secure application IFIS, which has employee contact information on it. The second critical function is external communications because she works in the communications department. So she identified this as priority number 2. So the recovery time objective for this function is also 1 day. Replication is the recovery point objective. It can't be done effectively manually because of the scope of the Anchorage School District and how many people they need to communicate with if there is an emergency. And the applications that would be needed would be email, and there is a robocall application that they use very often. So when it comes to relocation and offsite data storage, they do have a relocation plan, and Morgan identified that it does work. They plan to relocate to the King Tech Career Center because they have personnel that work there, and because it's close and they're able to perform the duties that they need to there. When it comes to offsite data storage, the first important thing is vital records, and vital records are the primary cause of failure for a business to recover, is when they lose their vital records, and records are considered vital when they're important for continued functions. So the vital records for internal communication is staff and personnel lists and contact information. And that's to keep accountable and to make sure that they're able to contact everyone that they need to contact in the case of an emergency. And so these documents are both in a paper and electronic form. And once they have been relocated, they can access both. And for external communications, that would be school lists and the school emergency contact information. And it's the same once they're relocated, they can access both in a paper copy and electronic copy. So for resource requirements, they had, basic resources that were needed, such as staff. And in their contingency plan, they already have a plan for additional personnel to come in and fill roles as needed. When it comes to buildings, they do have the relocation plan in the site, being the King Tech Career Center, as well as an additional warehouse that they may be able to use. And that's already established and it is viable, it does work. Workstations that includes, or telephones and desks. And in the warehouse, they do have the additional equipment that would be needed, and it is reserved and in a ready state to go. Internet would be needed for external communications, definitely, because they can do internal communications manually. It's not as important, but for external communications, they definitely need internet access. For networked PCs, they can perform without the computers being networked, so it's not as high up as a priority. And finally, laptops is a resource that they really need, and same with internet, it's needed for external communications. The wonderful part is that they can meet all of these requirements in about 3 hours after identifying an emergency and identifying that they need to relocate. So with communication, the key personnel are the Community Outreach Director, which is Leslie, and the Communications Coordinator, which is Morgan. And they handle all the communications, including sending out alerts for emergency communications. And so when they communicate with stakeholders, some of their stakeholders are the school board, community members, students, and parents. And so with the school board, they would communicate by telephone, ideally. It's faster than sending an email, and you make sure that you get direct communication with someone. When it comes to the community members, social media is a great tool that they use. They can post on Facebook, and different members of the community will be able to see it without them having to try to contact everybody in the community. With parents, they'll send emails or robocalls, and those are really effective. And with students, they'll usually send out Blackboard announcements, or if it's really important or urgent, they can send a text message that will go to all the students. So when it comes to plan activation, the planning team will assess whether they need to send an emergency alert. Leslie is the communications director, so she will send the alert to the department heads, and if she's not able to, Morgan does. And then for a damage assessment, the planning team will evaluate and determine the need for activation and who will respond along with that. When it comes to training, testing your plans is really important to ensure that it is effective. And so training, all personnel and employees will review the plans with their department heads, and new employees will go over the plan in orientation. Quarterly, they will do training. They'll do walkthroughs where the department heads will perform response functions with employees. They'll do evacuation drills to their designated area, and that'll help practice accountability procedures. And then annually they'll do a full-scale training with a real-life emergency will be simulated, and it'll include response employees and management, and then community response organizations such as the fire and police. And with these trainings, they'll have evaluations, and they'll use exercise evaluation guides, and these will be later used to create after action reports, which will identify corrective measures and actions to help revise the plan. And they'll revise the plan annually or review it annually as well. And that is the end. Thank you.